We have a few things that have come together here to help me determine what we're going to do next as far as our series of sermons, because we just finished one on James. And so one of the factors involved is that whenever I finish one series, whatever testament it's in, I like to switch to the other one. So that was in the New Testament, so it's time now to go to the Old Testament. So that was one of the decisions that I had to make. The other one was, what book was I going to go to in the Old Testament? Well, for a while, I've wanted to do the Psalms, but that is difficult. It's tricky to do the Psalms because there's 150 of them, so that's a lot to have to try to cover. And because if I were to do that and actually give it the attention that it deserves, it'd probably take like 2 years, something like that, to just do them end on end that way. And on the other hand, if I try to do one series that would be the general length that I normally do, like between 10 and 15 sermons, well, that's cutting it way too short. That's trying to cover way too much ground. So I couldn't do that either. And so what I decided was, what I'll do instead is break the Psalms up according to the different categories that exist for it, because there's quite a few in the book of Psalms. And so we'll do series on those every so often and mix them into the rest of what we do. So as far as which category to do, well, I was helped to determine that on the basis of the time of year that it is, because today is October 31st, so it's Halloween. November starting tomorrow, we're going into the holidays, and Thanksgiving is one of the categories of the Psalms. And I really love Thanksgiving, and I'll admit, I actually said this last year, that Christmas is my favorite holiday of all, so especially look forward to that following on Thanksgiving. But still, Thanksgiving doesn't really get the attention that I think it deserves. And it's a very important holiday, something that we should celebrate for all it's worth, understanding what Thanksgiving really is, seeing what God has done for us, and extending gratitude for that. And understanding that thanks is more than saying it, it's living it. It's living out of knowing what God has done for us and living in a way that appreciates it by pursuing His will. And so that's what we're going to be looking at through these next couple of weeks up until, and I think just following Thanksgiving. And so starting today with Psalm 34. That's where we're going to find that God does deliver those who fear Him. And so we need to experience that, to taste and see that the Lord is good. And so if you're following along in your Bibles, then Psalm 34 is where you want to head today. While you're doing that, I did just want to do what I normally do when we start a new book, is to provide kind of some background on the book in its entirety. The Psalms are interesting. The book of Psalms is interesting because it's sort of like the Bible in miniature in the way that it was composed. It was written by a few different authors. As opposed to most of the rest of the books of the Bible, you have one person who's basically in charge. A lot of the Psalms were written by King David, and probably people are familiar with that, but there are a few others who were involved as well, wrote numerous Psalms. And they did this also, like the Bible, over the course of quite a few years. There's a few centuries in between the earliest and the latest Psalms. And then also, like the Bible, like I said, there's a lot of different categories. So like in the Bible, you have a lot of different genres. You have things like poetry like this, or history, or prophecy. Well, you've got different categories in the Psalms as well. Thanksgiving, and praise, and messianic ones, and laments, and all those different things. And so it's a nice kind of small picture of what all of Scripture looks like. But the thing that unites the Psalms is that they are poetry, that they are the lyrics of worship. This was the chief expression of worship, of devotion, in ancient Israel. And it endures in its value because it presents the model of prayer. That was what it was for at the time. So it's Scripture, so it's inspired by God. It is His Word. It is Him speaking to His people, all of it. But it was also His invitation for them to speak to Him. So this is what we can still do. Approach the Lord these ways in order to revitalize our worship, in order to get the same value out of them that those ancient Israelites did. So that's the Psalms in general. Psalm 34 in particular starts with something that's not actually part of the Psalm, because a lot of them do this too. It has an introductory comment that sets the stage for it. That's what we find in the first half of the first verse. Psalm 34:1 says, "A psalm of David when he pretended madness before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed." And so this was the incident that inspired David to sing this song. And it is found recorded in the Bible. It's in 1 Samuel. Most of it's in chapter 21 there. A little bit of it is in chapter 22. But what happened was that David had, by this point, already killed Goliath, and so that made him famous. and then he became part of Saul's military, King Saul of Israel. He was also serving Saul by singing to him in order to calm him because of a spirit that he was dealing with that was causing him to basically have episodes of mania. And David is growing more and more in influence, and he has also been anointed as God's chosen replacement for Saul. And the more that Saul sees of David's growing influence and popularity and kind of having an idea that he's going to be replaced, he reaches the point where he wants to kill David in order to prevent that from being able to happen. So David becomes aware of the plot against him, and he runs away. Where he runs to, for whatever reason, is to the Philistines, who were the enemies of Israel. In fact, he chooses Gath, which was the town that Goliath had come from. And that's where he goes. He makes the choice probably because of the stress that he was under. I don't really think it's the best one from my perspective 3,000 years later. But he decided that that was where he would go in order to try to hide out, probably on the basis, it's somewhat reasonable, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so he's thinking, they hate Saul more than me, surely, so they'll let me hide out here in order to frustrate him. Had to have been his guess. Didn't work out his way. They immediately identified him as a foe. They wanted to kill him. The only thing standing in the way was their king, Abimelech, who also looked like he was very near on turning against him as well. And so David, in order to try to get out of the situation that he found himself in, pretended to be insane. Now, to us, that maybe sounds, how is that going to help you? Because of the way that we deal with serious mental instability. If you have somebody who's in that state, then we do lock them away. We institutionalize them for their own safety, for the safety of others, and in an effort to treat them. That's not how the ancient world did things. In the ancient world, if anyone was exhibiting signs of madness, they believed that they were touched by the gods, that they were in some type of communication with a spirit that was making them act this way, and so they were afraid to do anything with or to them. They just wanted to stay as far away as possible. So David, by pretending to be mad, nobody's going to stay around him, nobody's even going to make eye contact with him. It gave him the space that he needed in order to make his escape, go back to Israel, and hide from Saul there. So in this situation, it was David's quick thinking that saved him. But he knew the truth that was beyond that, that really it was the Lord who had allowed the situation to work out in his favor this way, who was watching over him, who protected him, especially in that immediate period where they could have just killed him when he showed his face, and had even really given him the ability to come up with that plan to get out of Dodge, or get out of Gath, I guess, in this case. And so that was what led him to the thankfulness that we find in this psalm that begins in earnest when we return to verse 1. It says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. So this is, and it actually comes up again later as well, an example of something else that happens in the Psalms with some frequency, is that basically every psalm has a category that it fits into, but it's never a neat category, or very rarely a neat category, because you can find some others that it sort of attaches to as well. And that's the case with these couple of verses, because we're finding praise in this Thanksgiving psalm. And they are subtly different. There's a distinction that we do have to make. Thanks is for what God has done for us. And so it's coming up with a particular example that you can point at. This is an action that God has taken in the world on our behalf in order to make things better for us. Praise doesn't really refer to what God has done. Praise is just on the basis of who God is and offering him glory. And so praise is something that's supposed to be given at all times because circumstances don't matter. God is just worthy of honor from everyone, from the humble who hear of this and are glad. That they are the people who understand that they have nothing and are nothing apart from God, and so they have to kneel to him, submit to him, look to him for salvation because they can't do it on their own. And actually, it could be even a little bit more specific than that, because the word that's translated humble, you could also translate it as poor. And so maybe it's those who are impoverished that David is referring to, and so that could kind of tie into what we learn so much about in the book of James, because in James he was telling the people who were poor Don't try to find comfort in creating conflict and seeking revenge against your oppressors. Don't try to find it in taking what belongs to them and can't belong to you by coveting it. Don't try to find comfort by showing them partiality, buttering up to them at the cost of others who are as poor as yourself. Instead, find your comfort in knowing the Lord. Lean on Him and He will give you what you need. No matter what is going on, that is what you have to do. And so David may very well be pointing to them as the example of what devotion is supposed to look like. It's only after this that he then does go into the thanks that he is feeling and wants to express. In verse 4, he says, I sought the Lord, and He heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. They looked to Him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear Him and delivers them. So David is thankful, and he's sharing that thanks with everyone, and this has been shared now for 3,000 years, because he is grateful that God heard him. That God heard him in his time of trouble and answered his prayer and saved him. And that's really what he's doing in verse 6, is pointing to himself and saying, this poor wretch who had to pretend to be crazy, God even acknowledged him. He was not beneath the Lord's notice. And so what does that say about the Lord? And then he points to others who have had that same experience of crying out and being acknowledged. And his point is, and again, he's talking about the poor, if they have done that, then everyone can. And everyone should. Because the only way to be delivered from fear is by fear. Strange way to put it, but that is what he says. Because he's talking about the state of terror that he had been in, where it looked like he was going to die. He's out of the frying pan with Saul and into the fire with the Philistines. But he knew that the Lord was greater than all of his fears. And so rather than responding to them in ways that might have been self-destructive or that would have given up on God, he submitted to God, put himself under His protection because he knew that was the only way he could be saved. It's still the only way that we can be saved. We have to look to God. We have to remember that He is greater than everything. He is most to be respected. And so we pursue His will first, and above everything else, allow the rest to follow, because He will look out for us. But we have to be willing to actually do that. That's what David says next in what's kind of considered the heart of this psalm in verse 8. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in Him. Oh, fear the Lord, you His saints. There is no want for those who fear Him. The young lions lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. This is kind of then what helps us tie into Thanksgiving as a holiday, especially because he's talking about food. He's talking about tasting and recognizing that God provides what it is that we need for life. Still a little bit of a strange turn of phrase to be talking about tasting the Lord's goodness, but it is the truth, is that God ought to be really tried, not just sampled. That's the temptation sometimes, is to just try to kind of pick, and what I've called before a buffet, and others have, I didn't come up with this, but buffet-style Christianity, where you just take the bits and pieces that you want, but you leave the rest that you don't want to have to deal with. You're not really investing in the things of God that way. But if you really do consume them, then you'll find satisfaction in Him, just like being filled after a good meal. And just like having food that enters the body, we can incorporate Him into our lives to make His will a part of them so that we can live out of it, be strengthened by it. And then when we have done this, we should do what David did. Invite others. Tell them, you should try it too. You should see what God has provided. You should taste and see. Find what we have found, because even the very strongest find a limit to what they can provide for themselves. He talks about the young lions, powerful animals, capable of really amazing physical feats, but sometimes they do go hungry when they can't find what they need. But Even the very weakest who lean on the Lord will find in the end that they lack nothing, like the sparrows that Jesus speaks of in the Sermon on the Mount. If God provides for them, then how much more for us? Now, following this, David makes another change in category, like I was talking about. This is what we find in verse 11. He says, "Come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Who is the man who desires life and loves many days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it." This is wisdom. It's wisdom in the general sense. We define this when we were going through the book of James because he talks about it. And wisdom is knowing what God's will is, but then actually doing it. Because knowledge doesn't mean anything if it doesn't have practical application. And so this is what David is saying to do, but more specifically, this is a wisdom interjection. This is the wisdom style, which a lot of Hebrew poetry is in. In particular, the book of Proverbs. That's what basically the entire thing is. And it's passing on to future generations what they need to know. It's a pedantic style. It's a teaching style. And so it's a kind of a shift that David, like I said, is engaging in here in order to say everybody needs to be aware of what it takes to experience God's goodness. Because it has to start, again, with respecting Him, with fearing Him, with knowing that He is greatest. So we can't put ourselves above Him. And it is Proverbs that says that exact same thing. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so this is the idea that he's building on, that his son Solomon is eventually going to pick up on. And then, of course, actually acts on that knowledge to avoid evil and to pursue peace. Now remember, that was one more thing that we saw in James, is that peace is not just the absence of conflict. That's a part of it, but it's more than that. Peace is health. Peace is wholeness. It's being complete in what God offers. That is what is available to those who go after the Lord instead of away from the Lord, to those who will actually engage with Him, who will taste and see that He is good. And if they will, they find that He is caring for them. That's what we find next in verse 15. It says, "The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart and saves such as have a contrite spirit." So David breaks everybody up, really, in the entire world, into two categories, the righteous and the evil. And he says that all of them are being watched by God. Just means something very different depending on which category they fall into, because the righteous can know that God is watching over them, that His eyes are on them, that whatever they are going through, He's still in control. He still cares. He's still bringing about their good. They don't have to be afraid. On the other hand, the evil also need to know that God's watching them too. He sees what they're doing. They should be dismayed by that, because He is going to hold them accountable. And we need to know what it means to be evil, because this is something that a lot of people get wrong, because they think that there's no way that it could apply to them. They hear the word evil and they figure that's got to mean monstrous. And so it's kind of the time of year for that again, Halloween. And so maybe some people, if they hear evil, they're going to think about witches and werewolves and vampires and things of that sort. Or maybe they're going to think, especially at other times of the years, historical evil. Like Hitler and Stalin and Jeffrey Dahmers and things like that have occurred in the world, where you think of the very worst of the worst that everybody can point to and say they are horrible. They are monsters. But that's not what evil means. And the kind of terrible thing, if you consider even those cases, is that they thought that they were doing what was good, at least for themselves. And that's what always happens with evil. It looks good. It can feel good. It can be enjoyable, at least for the short term. But the problem is that it is an attempt at self-reliance, self-seeking, rather than pursuing the will of God, rather than looking to Him for His provision. It's any type of rebellion against Him, any way of disobeying what he has said to do, and it will lead to destruction for anyone who persists in it. But righteousness, on the other hand, does not mean what, again, people will generally think, which is flawlessness. And that's not what it is. And in that previous passage on wisdom, it did make it clear we are supposed to pursue virtue, but we have to understand our limits. That it's not about making ourselves so good that God has to give us what we want. That's self-righteousness. And so it's just another form of self-seeking. It can be very religious, but can actually be evil in that way. What we have to do is admit that we need forgiveness. It's that contrition that God hears, that God sees, that he responds to. It is why he declares us to be in good standing with him, which is what righteousness means. And we have to know where that comes from. It's not from us. It's from what David does actually mention in passing as he closes the psalm. In verse 19, it says, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He guards all his bones. Not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous shall be condemned. But the Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who trust in him shall be condemned." Many of the afflictions of the righteous. David's talking about the suffering of the saints. He doesn't ignore it. He doesn't suggest that we avoid it. He certainly hadn't to this point in his life. He certainly wasn't going to. There's a lot of other horrible things that happened to him. It is a feature of life that shouldn't surprise us. It certainly horrifies us, the things that we have to go through. But they are what happen, and realizing that they can happen should keep it from shaking us. Should keep it from making us doubt, because deliverance is assured. And the source of assurance is what we find, and David probably didn't even realize it himself when he wrote it, but it's what we find in verse 20. Because in verse 20, he is pointing back to something that he is aware of in Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12 is where God establishes the Passover. And so as the Israelites are preparing to leave their enslavement in Egypt and go to the promised land, God is going to accomplish that with one final plague that is going to devastate the Egyptians in judgment for the evil that they have done. And the Lord tells the Israelites that each family, for each household, they are supposed to take a lamb and slaughter it, and then use its blood to paint their doorposts, because that is going to be the covering over them. That is how they are going to say, we identify with God, and God is going to pass over us when he comes in this judgment. One of the regulations for that lamb was that none of its bones were to be broken. It was, in that sense, to be left intact, supposed to have its integrity still. And so that is what David was mostly talking about, is that those who go through a situation where it feels like they're being sacrificed, well, they're still going to be whole, because God's going to bring them out of it. But what that was pointing forward to is what we find in John chapter 19, because that's when Jesus is on the cross. And while he was on the cross, as the day was going later, the Passover the Sabbath for the Passover was going to be starting that evening. And the Jewish authorities did not want the victims of the crucifixion, or the criminals as they saw them, to be left to die on the Sabbath. They wanted the process to be sped up. So they asked the Romans to do so. The Romans had a way of doing that. They'd break their legs. Because the way that crucifixion works is through asphyxiating them. That as they draw in a breath, they're not able to push their diaphragms back down. And so every breath becomes shorter and shorter and shorter until they choke and can't draw in any more air. If you break their legs, that happens even faster, because they have less strength in their body as they're hanging there for that process of breathing. And so they broke the legs of the one on his right and on his left. When they came to Jesus, he was already dead. And they made sure of that by stabbing him through the heart at that time, but he was already gone, and so it meant that his bones did not have to be broken, that he was left, in that sense, intact, and fulfilled the words of this psalm about him, where we have yet another category added in because this is a messianic prophecy in this psalm as well, and said that, yes, whatever you're going through, but none of your bones are going to be broken, and you will be taken out of it. Now, if Jesus' bones had been broken, that almost would have been the least thing that he would have suffered at that point. A broken bone in comparison to crucifixion, it's not really much of anything. But it was the point that God did as he said he was going to do, that he was whole, and then he was rescued 3 days later when he rose to life again. And in his resurrection made it so that we could receive life as well. Now, he went through all of that because his sacrifice was the cost of our redemption. But he made it so that through him, we do not fear the condemnation of our souls, just as this word promises. So that is why with David, even more than David knew, we too can and should offer thanks at this time, at all times. And that's the word that we are supposed to be here to spread to anybody who needs to know it, and maybe somebody watching who needs to know that whatever you are afraid of, it can be overcome. The Lord will deliver anyone who looks to Christ in faith, who gave his life for them. But they need to actually try it. They need to go to him for the good that he has in store and be filled. And so I invite anybody, whether here or anywhere, who's not done so, to do it now. Because it's the only thing that you have to do. But it's also the only thing that you can do in order to be saved. Now, for those who are saved, remember, as we're shown here, that whatever it is that is happening, God does see you. He does hear you. He has you safely in hand. So thank him always. And live out of that gratitude by avoiding evil, by pursuing peace, and for the sake of others, sharing that provision so that they too can join in our thanks.